On the morning of July 1st, 1863, the quiet town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania woke up to the distant sound of marching soldiers. For months, the American Civil War had been spreading across the country. Entire regions had already seen battles, but many small towns still lived in relative peace, hoping the conflict would stay far away from their homes. Gettysburg was one of those towns. With its small streets, brick houses, and farms surrounding the countryside, it looked like any other peaceful American community of the 19th century. Local residents were used to the slow rhythm of daily life. Farmers worked the land, shopkeepers opened their doors early in the morning, and children played along the dusty roads. But on that summer morning, everything was about to change. Soldiers were approaching the town. Two massive armies were moving toward each other. The Union Army from the north and the Confederate Army from the south. Both sides were preparing for what would soon become one of the most important battles of the entire war. The people of Gettysburg had no idea that their town would soon become the center of history. And among the residents watching the approaching soldiers was a man who looked very different from the young troops marching toward the battlefield. His name was John Burns. He was not a trained soldier. He was not an officer. And he certainly was not a young man ready for war. John Burns was 69 years old. In the 1860s, reaching the age of 69 was already considered remarkable. Life was harder, medical care was limited, and most people at that age were expected to spend their days resting or helping their families with small tasks around the home. But John Burns was not like most men. He had lived in Gettysburg for many years and was known by locals as a stubborn and independent person. He had strong opinions about the war that was dividing the country, and he openly supported the Union cause. As Confederate forces moved closer to the town, many residents began preparing to hide or flee. Families gathered their belongings, worried that fighting might soon reach the streets of Gettysburg. But Burns made a very different decision. Instead of running away from the approaching battle, he started preparing for it. He put on a simple civilian outfit, including a dark coat and an old hat. Then he grabbed a rifle, not a brand new military weapon, but an older firearm that he owned. With the rifle in his hands, Burns began walking toward the sound of the battle. The roads leading outside Gettysburg were already filling with Union soldiers moving into position. Dust rose into the air as columns of troops marched toward the fields where the first clashes were beginning. When soldiers noticed the elderly man approaching them with a rifle, many were confused. Some thought he might be delivering supplies. Others assumed he had lost his way. But when Burns reached the Union lines, he made his intentions clear. He wanted to fight. At first, the soldiers didn't know how to react. Standing in front of them was a 69-year-old civilian asking to join a battle that thousands of trained soldiers were preparing to fight. War was brutal and chaotic, and even young men often struggled to survive the dangers of the battlefield. Allowing an elderly civilian to participate seemed almost unthinkable. Some officers reportedly told Burns that he should return to town and stay safe. But Burns refused. He insisted that if the battle was coming to Gettysburg, then he had the right to defend his home. Eventually, a few soldiers decided to let him stay with them near the front lines. They handed him ammunition and pointed toward the fields where Confederate troops were beginning to appear. The sounds of battle were growing louder. Cannons thundered in the distance. Rifles cracked across the fields. Smoke began rising above the farmland surrounding the town. The Battle of Gettysburg had begun. And somewhere among the young soldiers preparing to face the enemy stood a man nearly 70 years old, holding a rifle and waiting for the moment he would join the fight. His decision would soon turn him into one of the most unusual figures in the entire history of the Civil War. As the morning of July 1st unfolded, the quiet farmland outside Gettysburg transformed into a battlefield. Union soldiers moved quickly into position across fields, fences, and small ridges surrounding the town. Officers shouted orders as units spread out to defend key areas from the approaching Confederate forces. The air was already thick with tension. From the distance, lines of Confederate troops could be seen moving forward across the countryside. Their gray uniforms appeared through the rising dust as they advanced toward Union positions. For the young soldiers preparing to face them, the moment was terrifying. Many had never experienced a battle this large before. But among those soldiers stood someone completely unexpected: John Burns. The elderly civilian with the old rifle had refused to leave. Instead, he positioned himself near a group of Union soldiers along a fence line that overlooked an open field. The soldiers around him were barely half his age. Some were in their early 20s. Yet the old man stood beside them calmly, gripping his rifle and watching the distant enemy lines. One soldier later recalled that Burns seemed completely fearless. While younger soldiers nervously checked their weapons and waited for orders, Burns simply stared toward the approaching Confederate troops as if he had already made peace with whatever might happen next. Soon, the first shots of the battle echoed across the fields. The fight for Gettysburg had begun. As Confederate soldiers advanced across the open fields, Union troops began firing. Rifles cracked in rapid succession, sending clouds of smoke drifting across the battlefield. The noise was overwhelming: gunfire, shouting, and the distant thunder of cannons. John Burns raised his rifle and joined the fight. For a moment, the young soldiers near him could hardly believe what they were seeing. A 69-year-old civilian was calmly aiming and firing at enemy soldiers, just like the trained troops beside him. But Burns did not hesitate. He loaded his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired again. Then again, and again. Some soldiers later described how the elderly man appeared completely focused, ignoring the chaos around him as he continued shooting from behind the fence. The battle intensified. Confederate forces pushed forward, and the Union line struggled to hold its position. Smoke covered the fields, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Yet Burns remained in place. Despite the danger surrounding him, he refused to retreat. For a man of his age, simply standing in the middle of such a battle was extraordinary. But John Burns was doing far more than standing. He was fighting. As the battle continued, Confederate troops began closing in on the Union position. The fighting grew more intense with every passing minute. Bullets struck fences, trees, and the ground around the soldiers as both sides exchanged fire. At some point during the chaos, John Burns was hit. A bullet struck his arm. Another grazed his leg. Still, he did not immediately leave the battlefield. Accounts from soldiers later described how Burns attempted to continue fighting even after being wounded. But the situation around him was rapidly collapsing. Union troops were slowly being pushed back toward the town of Gettysburg as Confederate forces gained ground. Realizing the danger, Burns finally began moving away from the front lines. The elderly man who had walked calmly into battle was now wounded and struggling to reach safety. Yet even in that moment, his determination remained remarkable. He had come to defend his town. And for as long as he possibly could, he had done exactly that. By the end of the day, the old man who had insisted on fighting beside the soldiers would become one of the most talked about figures of the entire battle. As the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg slowly came to an end, the battlefield was filled with smoke, noise, and confusion. Union forces had been pushed back toward the town after hours of intense fighting. Soldiers moved quickly through fields and roads as commanders tried to reorganize their lines for the next stage of the battle. Across the countryside, wounded soldiers from both sides lay scattered across the ground. Some were calling for help. Others were attempting to crawl towards safer areas. Among them was John Burns. The 69-year-old man who had walked into battle that morning was now wounded and exhausted. Bullets had struck him during the fighting, leaving him unable to move easily. His arm was bleeding, and pain spread through his body as he struggled to remain conscious. The battlefield around him had grown strangely quiet compared to the chaos from earlier. Most Union troops had already retreated toward the town of Gettysburg. But the Confederate soldiers were now moving forward across the same fields where Burns had been fighting only hours before. And soon they would find him. For John Burns, the danger was not over. In fact, it might only be beginning. As Confederate soldiers advanced through the battlefield searching for wounded men and remaining enemies, they soon noticed the elderly figure lying near the fence line. At first, they assumed he was simply another injured civilian caught in the chaos of the battle. But when they looked closer, something seemed unusual. Near Burns was a rifle, and scattered around him were several empty ammunition cartridges. The Confederate soldiers quickly realized something important. This elderly man had not just been caught in the battle. He had been part of it. They began questioning him. Why was he there? Why was he armed? Why had he been firing at Confederate troops? Burns understood immediately how dangerous the situation was. He was surrounded by enemy soldiers who had just fought a brutal battle. If they believed he had deliberately joined the fight as a civilian, the consequences could be unpredictable. So the old man made a quick decision. Instead of admitting the truth, he told them a different story. He claimed that he had been walking through the area when the fighting suddenly began. According to Burns, he had simply been caught in the crossfire. It was a risky explanation, but it might be his only chance to survive. The Confederate soldiers listened carefully as the wounded man explained his story. Burns spoke calmly, describing himself as an unfortunate civilian who had been trapped between two armies. The soldiers examined the area around him again. The rifle, the ammunition, the position where he had been found. Some of them likely suspected that the story was not entirely true. After all, very few civilians would be carrying a rifle in the middle of a battlefield. But the situation around them was still chaotic. The battle had not completely ended, and soldiers were focused on securing the area rather than investigating every wounded person they encountered. Eventually, the Confederate troops made a decision. Instead of treating him as a combatant, they allowed Burns to remain where he was until medical help could reach the area. It was a small moment of fortune for the elderly man, because if things had unfolded differently, his fate could have been far worse. As night began to fall over Gettysburg, the wounded fighter who had dared to join one of the most famous battles in American history was still alive. But his incredible story was far from over. In the days that followed, the entire country would hear about the old man who had picked up a rifle and walked into war. When the fighting around Gettysburg finally slowed after the first day of battle, the countryside was left in a state of devastation. Fields that had once been quiet farmland were now covered with broken fences, abandoned equipment, and wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict. Medical teams began moving through the area, searching for survivors who could still be treated. Among the wounded they discovered was the elderly man who had shocked soldiers earlier that day. John Burns was carefully transported back toward the town of Gettysburg, where doctors and volunteers were already struggling to care for hundreds of injured soldiers. Despite his wounds, Burns had survived the battle. For many people in town, the news was difficult to believe. An elderly civilian had walked into one of the largest battles of the Civil War and lived to tell the story. Neighbors who had known Burns for years suddenly realized that the stubborn old man they had often seen walking through town had just done something extraordinary. As he began recovering from his injuries, word of his actions slowly started spreading among soldiers and civilians alike. And soon, people far beyond Gettysburg would hear about the old man who refused to stay home while his town was under threat. In the days following the Battle of Gettysburg, journalists and visitors began arriving in the town to document what had happened. The battle had already become one of the most significant moments of the Civil War, and newspapers across the country were eager to share stories from the battlefield. Among the many accounts of bravery and sacrifice, one story stood out: the story of John Burns. Reporters quickly became fascinated by the idea that a 69-year-old civilian had picked up a rifle and joined Union soldiers in combat. They interviewed witnesses who had seen him fighting along the fence lines outside the town. Some soldiers described how Burns had calmly fired his rifle while standing beside men young enough to be his grandsons. Others remembered how he had refused to leave even when officers warned him about the danger. The newspapers soon began calling him something unforgettable: the hero of Gettysburg. Within weeks, the old man who had once been just another resident of a small Pennsylvania town had become a national symbol of determination and courage. People across the country were reading about him, and many could hardly believe the story was real. As John Burns recovered from his injuries, he began receiving visitors who wanted to meet the man they had read about in newspapers. Some were soldiers who had fought in the battle, Others were curious citizens who simply wanted to shake his hand and hear his story. Burns became known as one of the most unusual figures connected to the Battle of Gettysburg. Artists even began painting scenes of the old man standing beside Union soldiers during the fighting. One of the most famous paintings depicted Burns calmly holding his rifle while young soldiers battled around him. The image helped turn his story into a powerful symbol of civilian courage during the Civil War. Even President Abraham Lincoln is believed to have met John Burns when he visited Gettysburg later that year to deliver the famous Gettysburg Address. For Burns, life would never return to the quiet routine he had known before the battle. He had simply followed what he believed was the right thing to do. But his decision to walk into the battlefield had transformed him into something much larger. He had become a living legend. As the war continued beyond Gettysburg, John Burns returned to a quieter life, but nothing was ever quite the same again. The small town that had once been his peaceful home had become one of the most famous battlefields in American history. Visitors began arriving from across the country, walking through the same fields where soldiers had fought and where the elderly man had once stood with a rifle. Burns, now widely recognized, was no longer just another resident of Gettysburg. He had become a living reminder of the battle. People who met him often saw more than just an old man. They saw someone who had made an extraordinary decision in a moment of uncertainty. He had not been trained. He had not been ordered to fight. And yet, when faced with the reality of war arriving at his doorstep, he chose to act. His story spread through newspapers, conversations, and personal accounts. Over time, it became part of the larger narrative of the Civil War itself. Among stories of generals, strategies, and massive armies, the image of a 69-year-old civilian standing beside soldiers remained unforgettable. It was simple, but powerful. In the years that followed, John Burns continued to be remembered as one of the most unusual figures connected to the Battle of Gettysburg. Artists painted him. Writers described him. And historians included his story when discussing the human side of the war. He represented something that went beyond military strategy or political conflict. He represented individual choice. At an age when most people would avoid danger, Burns had walked directly toward it. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. Even today, his story stands out because it challenges expectations. War is often associated with youth, strength, and training. But Burns showed that determination and conviction can come from unexpected places. His actions did not change the outcome of the battle, but they changed how people remembered it. And sometimes that matters just as much. John Burns passed away in 1872, less than a decade after the Battle of Gettysburg. But his story did not disappear with him. Instead, it became part of history. Today, visitors who travel to Gettysburg can still learn about the old man who refused to stay behind while others fought. His name is remembered not because he was a general or a famous commander, but because he made a decision that most people would never consider. He stepped into a battlefield at nearly 70 years old. He faced danger alongside men far younger than himself, and he survived to tell the story. In the end, the legacy of John Burns is not just about war. It is about courage. It is about conviction. And it is about the idea that no matter your age or circumstances, a single decision can define how you are remembered. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the most unexpected people.